They say the hands are the first part of the body to remember what the mind tries to forget. Mine remember the rhythm. Loop, pull, tuck. Loop, pull, tuck. It's a meditative language, a way of speaking without ever opening your mouth. For 40 years, I've used a crochet hook to build armor for the people I love. Heavy quilts to keep out the winter, delicate booties for feet that haven't touched the ground yet. You'd think, after 6 decades on this earth, I would have learned that you cannot protect people who find your warmth suffocating. I sat in the corner of that pristine, white-on-white living room, my hands resting on my lap. The air smelled of expensive lilies and a desperate sort of overachievement. My son's wife, a woman who views tradition as a stain on her modern aesthetic, was holding court. She looked at me once, a quick flick of the eyes that dismissed me as part of the furniture before returning to her circle of friends. Everything has to be curated, she told them, her voice like glass scraping against silk. A child's environment dictates their future clarity. No clutter. No dated influences. I felt the weight of the gift bag at my feet. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, was a quilt I had spent 6 months perfecting. Each square was a piece of our history, scraps from the dress I wore when I brought my son home from the hospital, a bit of the shirt his father wore the day he passed. It wasn't just fabric, it was a map. Beside it lay the crochet garments, soft Pima cotton in a shade of cream that took me weeks to source. I hadn't used a pattern. I don't need patterns. I know how things fit together. The tension wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream or a slammed door. It was the way my son wouldn't meet my eyes. He stood by the mimosa bar, adjusting his tie, looking everywhere but at his mother. He knew what was in that bag. He knew what it cost me, not in money, but in the ache of my arthritic knuckles and the hours of quiet prayer sewn into every seam. Yet, he looked at his wife with a sort of terrified devotion. "Time for gifts," someone chirped. I watched as she opened box after box of high-end Scandinavian plastic. Gray rattles, beige onesies, organic, minimalist teething rings that looked like stones. She squealed with a practiced delight for each one. Then, my son reached down and handed her my bag. The room went a little quieter. They knew I was the old-school element in this polished new life. She didn't even fully remove the tissue. She pulled back one corner, saw the intricate, colorful handiwork of the quilt, the clutter she so despised, and her smile didn't just fade. It tightened. It became a tactical maneuver. "Oh," she said. "Oh. How thoughtful. It's so vibrant." She didn't set it on the table with the other gifts. She set it on the floor, behind her chair. My son looked at the floor, too. He didn't say a word. He didn't tell her that the blue thread in the corner came from his grandfather's Sunday best. He just offered her a fresh drink. It was a small moment, a normal moment by some standards. But as I sat there, I realized that I wasn't just an invited guest at this baby shower. I was a relic being phased out. They weren't just rejecting a blanket. They were discarding the foundation I had built for them to stand on. I stayed until the end. I helped clean up the stray ribbons. I moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who has nothing but time. And that's when I saw it. As the catering crew began to clear the room, my daughter-in-law leaned over to her sister and pointed at my bag. "Take that to the garage with the trash," she whispered. "I don't want that grandma aesthetic ruining the nursery photos. We'll donate it or something later." The sister didn't even hesitate. She picked up my 6 months of labor and walked toward the back door, where the heavy black bins were waiting. My son was 3 feet away. He heard her. He watched the bag go. And then he turned back to his wife and kissed her forehead. I didn't make a scene. I didn't cry. I simply reached into my purse, took out my reading glasses, and put them on. I wanted to see everything very clearly. I wanted to memorize the exact layout of their lives, the codes to their security, the rhythm of their routine. Because when someone tells you exactly who they are and what they value, the only polite thing to do is believe them and then act accordingly. I walked out of that house without saying goodbye. I drove home in total silence, the engine humming a low, steady tune. My hands weren't shaking. In fact, they felt more capable than they had in years. They knew exactly what the next project was going to be, and it wouldn't be a gift. You see, a quilt is made by joining pieces together. But if you know where to pull the single, hidden thread, the whole thing comes apart without a sound. And I am a master of finding the thread. I sat in my darkened living room that night, my crochet hook catching the moonlight like a silver needle. Most people think revenge is a hot, impulsive fire, but they've forgotten how I raised my son. I taught him that every action has a cost. He's simply forgotten that I'm the one who sets the price. As I began to unravel a fresh spool of black silk, I realized that my daughter-in-law didn't just throw away a blanket, she threw away her protection. And now, the door is wide open for what's coming next. Do you want to see how a discarded grandmother begins to pull the threads of $1 million life? Subscribe, comment, like, and share to see the first move in a game she doesn't even know she's playing. Trust me, the ending is one they never saw coming. Patience is a luxury the young rarely afford themselves. They see an elderly woman, and they see a slowing clock, a fading sunset. They don't realize that when you move slower, you see more. You notice the cracks in the foundation while they are still admiring the paint. My daughter-in-law, with her sterile white walls and her curated life, thought she had successfully discarded a nuisance. She didn't understand that by throwing that quilt into the darkness of the garage, she had handed me the blueprint to her own undoing. I spent the next week in a state of clinical observation. I didn't call to complain. I didn't send a stinging text. Instead, I sent a floral arrangement, white lilies, the same ones she had at the shower. The card read, "To a beautiful new beginning. I'm so glad we finally understand each other." She likely thought it was a surrender. In reality, it was a marker. I was letting her know I was still here, watching from the periphery, as silent as the dust she tried so hard to scrub away. My son called me 3 days later. His voice had that thin, reedy quality it gets when he's performing the role of a happy man. "Ma, thanks for the flowers. They're great. Listen, sorry about the shower. It was just a lot going on." You know how she gets about the vibe of the house. "I know exactly how she gets, son," I said, my voice as smooth as Riverstone. "I'm not upset. In fact, seeing how you two live has inspired me. I realize now that I've been holding onto the past too tightly. I think it's time I helped you both secure your future in a more modern way." The relief in his sigh was pathetic. He thought he was off the hook. He didn't ask what I meant by securing the future. He didn't ask why his mother, who had spent her life saving every penny from a humble clerk's salary, was suddenly interested in their high-stakes world of private equity and social standing. He just assumed I was finally falling in line. You see, my daughter-in-law comes from what she calls old money, though I've seen the ledgers. It's tired money. Her father's firm is a house of cards held together by reputation and a few strategic handshakes. They look down on people like me, people who work with their hands, because they've forgotten that the hands are what build the world. They think power is a title. I know power is knowing where the secret is buried. I began my research. I didn't use a computer at first. I used my social circle. People forget that the grandmas of the world are everywhere. We are the church secretaries, the retired paralegals, the women who clean the offices at night when the important people have gone home. We are the invisible infrastructure. I made 3 phone calls. By the end of the day, I knew about the liquidity issues her father was facing. I knew about the corner cutting on their latest development project. and I knew that my son had signed his name as a guarantor on a loan that would sink him if a single brick fell out of place. I sat on my porch, drinking tea that had gone cold, and thought about that quilt in the trash. It wasn't just about the fabric. It was about the fact that she believed I was a person who could be subtracted without changing the sum of the equation. She treated me like a variable she could zero out. I started a new project that night. Not a quilt this time. I took out my ledger, a real one bound in leather. I began to list every favor I was owed from 40 years of being the nice lady in the neighborhood, the judge whose children I watched when he was just a struggling lawyer, the bank manager whose mother I nursed through her final days, the city inspector who still calls me every Christmas. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for a surgical strike. The strategy was simple: isolation. If she wanted a life free of dated influences, I would give it to her. I would remove the safety net she didn't even know I was providing. For years, I had been the one smoothing over the rough edges of my son's reputation, quietly fixing the mistakes he made in his arrogance because he was my blood. No more. I watched their social media feeds, the curated perfection of their nursery, now devoid of anything handmade, anything soulful. She posted a photo of a store-bought, mass-produced blanket that cost $400 and looked like a hospital rag. Only the best for our little prince. The caption read. I smiled. It was a cold, thin expression. She wanted the best, but she had no idea that the best often comes with a hidden cost. She had traded a grandmother's protection for a brand name. The first move happened on a Tuesday. It was a small thing, a permit delay on her father's new luxury condo project. Just a minor clerical oversight by a friend of mine at the city office. A tiny snag in the thread, not enough to cause a panic, but enough to make them check the seams. But as the days passed, I realized that a small snag wouldn't be enough. To truly teach a lesson, you have to let them believe they are winning until the very second the floor disappears. I needed to get closer. I needed to be invited back into the inner sanctum. I picked up the phone and called her. Not my son. Her. Dear, I said, my voice dripping with a gentle, grandmotherly concern. I've been thinking. You're right about the house. It needs to be perfect. And I have some contacts in the Historical Preservation Society who are very interested in your father's new project. I'd love to host a small luncheon to introduce you. It's the least I can do after everything. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. She smelled an opportunity to climb. She didn't smell the trap. That's actually very kind of you, she said, her voice hesitant but hungry. Of course, I replied. I just want to make sure you have everything you deserve. As I hung up, I looked at the black silk I had been working with. It was strong, nearly unbreakable, and in the right light, it was completely invisible. The beauty of a luncheon is that it provides a civilized mask for the most uncivilized intentions. To my daughter-in-law, a luncheon was a stage, a place to display her status, her pregnancy glow, and her perceived dominance over me. She arrived at my home 2 weeks later, dressed in a maternity dress that probably cost more than my first car, looking like a swan who had accidentally landed in a duck pond. She walked through my door with a patronizing smile, her eyes scanning my modest living room for dust she could pity. It's so charmingly vintage, Mother, she said, using the title like a weight she was forced to carry. It's a home, I replied simply, ushering her toward the dining room. It has memory, something new houses often lack. I had set the table with my finest linens, the ones I had hand-tatted 30 years ago. I watched her eyes drop to the lace. I saw the flash of recognition, the memory of the quilt she tossed, followed quickly by the mental dismissal. To her, this was just more grandma clutter. She didn't realize that the three women already seated at the table were the most dangerous people she would ever meet. There was Clara, whose son sat on the zoning board. There was Martha, who handled the private accounts at the city's largest boutique bank. And there was Evelyn, a retired archivist who knew the lineage and the dirty laundry of every old money family in the state. To my daughter-in-law, they were just three elderly black women in church hats and sensible shoes. She treated them with the same polite, shallow boredom she offered a waitress. "So, I hear your father is expanding the waterfront development," Clara said, her voice like warm honey hiding a sting. "Quite an ambitious project for these economic times." My daughter-in-law beamed. "It's going to be the crown jewel of the city. We're aiming for total exclusivity. No compromises." I watched Evelyn sip her tea, her eyes fixed on the girl. "Exclusivity is a double-edged sword, dear. If you lock everyone out, there's no one left to help you when the doors get stuck from the outside." The girl laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "I think we'll be just fine. We have the best legal and financial teams money can buy." She spent the next hour bragging. She spoke about the nursery's Italian marble floors, a cold choice for a baby, I thought, and the private preschool she'd already scouted. She spoke about my son as if he were an accessory to her success, a stable foundation for her family's brand. She didn't notice the way Martha and Clara exchanged a glance when she mentioned the bridge loan her father had just secured. They knew, as I did, that the loan was backed by assets that didn't quite exist. I remained the perfect hostess. I refilled tea. I offered homemade biscuits. I stayed in the background, a shadow in my own home. I was waiting for the moment of total overconfidence, the point where the ego outruns the intellect. It came when she started talking about the pests in the neighborhood. "The problem with these older areas," she said, gesturing vaguely toward my window, "is the resistance to progress. People cling to these crumbling structures and tradition because they're afraid of the future. My father says sometimes you have to just clear the ground to build something worthwhile." The table went silent. It wasn't the silence of offense. It was the silence of a predator marking a target. These women had built this neighborhood. They had marched for the parks she wanted to privatize. They had funded the scholarships for the children she wanted to displace. "I see," I said, finally sitting down. "Clear the ground. Throw away the old to make room for the new, like a handmade quilt in a trash bin." Her face went pale for a fraction of a second, then hardened. "I didn't think you'd take that personally. It was just impractical for the nursery. You have to understand, we have a specific vision." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said, leaning in. "Visions are beautiful, but they require light to see, and lights can be turned off very easily." She looked around the table, finally sensing the shift in the room. The air had grown heavy, the way it does right before a summer storm breaks. Martha set her teacup down with a definitive clack. "You know," Martha said, "I was looking at some files the other day. It's funny how visionary projects often have such thin margins. One little delay, one revoked tax credit, and the whole thing unspools." My daughter-in-law tried to regain her footing. "Our credits are secured. My father has friends in the governor's office." "Friends are like threads," I said softly. "They're only as strong as the person holding the needle. And honey, you've been very careless with your needles." She left shortly after, claiming a sudden fatigue. She didn't thank me for the meal. She didn't hug me. She practically fled to her SUV, her heels clicking frantically on my sidewalk. As the door closed, Evelyn turned to me. "She's hollow, Joyce. There's nothing holding that girl up but starch and arrogance." "I know," I said. "That's why it's going to be so quiet when she collapses." "What's the move?" Clara asked. I looked at the empty seat where my daughter-in-law had been sitting. On the floor next to it, she had dropped a silk scarf, a designer piece expensive and cold. I picked it up with 2 fingers. The move is simple, I said. We stop protecting my son, and we start looking into the environmental impact of her father's waterfront project. I believe there's an endangered species of tradition they're trying to build over, and I happen to know the person who files the injunctions. That night, I didn't crochet. I sat in my office and opened a folder I hadn't touched in years. It contained the deeds to the 3 small lots directly adjacent to her father's development, land I had bought for pennies decades ago and kept in a blind trust. They needed those lots for their access road. Without them, the crown jewel was landlocked and worthless. The first sign of a true storm isn't the thunder. It's the way the birds go quiet and the sky turns a bruised, unnatural shade of green. For my daughter-in-law and her father, that green wasn't the sky. It was the color of the money they were about to lose. My daughter-in-law's father, a man who prided himself on being a visionary, had spent years treating the city's administrative staff like background noise. He never bothered to learn the name of the woman in the clerk's office who had handled his filings for 20 years. Her name is Beatrice, and she has been my Sunday school partner since 1994. I met Beatrice at our usual diner on a rainy Monday morning. We didn't talk about business at first. We talked about her grandchildren and the recipe for my lemon pound cake. Only when the coffee was nearly gone did I slide a small, handwritten note across the table. The waterfront project, I said quietly. I hear the easement filings for the access road are complicated. Beatrice didn't even look at the note. She just leaned back and adjusted her spectacles. Complicated isn't the word, Joyce. They're incomplete. It seems someone assumed the 3 lots bordering the north side were public utility land. They've already started pouring the foundation for the main gate on property they don't own. I smiled. And who owns those lots, Beatrice? A private trust, she said, her eyes twinkling behind her lenses. The Heritage Preservation Trust. It was established 30 years ago. Very quiet, very legal, and very, very firm about its boundaries. I nodded. That trust was my father's legacy to me. A few strips of worthless dirt he'd held onto because he believed that one day the city would grow toward the water. He was a man who understood that land is the only thing they aren't making any more of. My daughter-in-law's family thought they could simply pave over the past. They didn't realize the past had a deed. The psychological game is about timing. If I had told them I owned the land immediately, they would have offered me a check. They would have tried to buy their way out of the inconvenience. But I didn't want their money. I wanted them to spend theirs. I wanted them to commit. I wanted them to build 80% of a dream that could never be finished. By the following week, the tension in my son's house was starting to leak out through the cracks. He called me, his voice sounding frayed, like a rope under too much tension. "Ma, there's some weird stuff going on with the project," he said. He was trying to sound casual, but I could hear his wife in the background, her voice sharp and frantic, barking orders at someone on the phone. The city issued a stop work order on the north gate. Some paperwork issue. You haven't heard anything around the neighborhood, have you? I'm just an old woman in a rocking chair. Son, I said, my voice the picture of grandmotherly innocence. What would I know about city gates? I'm busy making sure my clutter doesn't get in anyone's way. There was a long silence on the other end. He wasn't a stupid man, but he was a compromised one. He had traded his intuition for a seat at a table that didn't really have a place for him. Ma, about the shower, she's just stressed. The baby is coming, and the investors are breathing down her father's neck. Everything has to be perfect. Perfection is a brittle thing, son. I said gently, the harder you squeeze it, the faster it shatters. Tell your wife to stay hydrated. Stress isn't good for the little prince. I hung up before he could respond. I didn't want to hear his excuses. I wanted him to feel the weight of the silence. That evening, I went into my spare bedroom, the one I had intended to be the nursery, when they visited. It was empty now, save for my sewing machine and my baskets of yarn. I sat down and began to work on a new garment. It wasn't a baby sweater. It was a suit. Deep charcoal, sharp lines, impeccable construction. If I was going to be the villain in their story, I was going to be the best dressed one they had ever seen. The beauty of their situation was their own arrogance. They had already pre-sold half of the luxury units. They had taken deposits from people even more powerful and impatient than they were. Every day the stop work order remained in place, they were losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in penalties. And because they had cleared the ground so aggressively, they had no goodwill left in the community to call upon for a favor. I watched through the digital window of their social media. The curated posts had stopped. The photos of the white-on-white nursery were replaced by silence. Then, finally, a photo of my daughter-in-law looking exhausted, with a caption about overcoming obstacles and haters of progress. She still didn't know who her obstacle was. She thought she was fighting a faceless bureaucracy. She thought she was fighting the city. She had no idea she was fighting the woman who used to wash her husband's socks. I took a sip of my chamomile tea and picked up my crochet hook. I wasn't making anything specific, just a long, thin cord of black silk, strong enough to hold a weight, thin enough to be missed until it's already around your neck. In engineering, there is a concept called the yield point. It is the exact moment when a material, under extreme pressure, stops deforming elastically and begins to break. Up until that point, you can remove the stress, and the structure will return to its original shape. But once you cross it, the damage is permanent. I sat in my garden, watching a spider weave a web between two rose bushes, and I realized my son's new family had just reached their yield point. The call didn't come from my son this time. It came from her father. He didn't call me Joyce. He called me Mrs. Thompson, using a tone of forced reverence that men of his stature reserve for people they've realized they can't bully. He had spent 48 hours trying to track down the owners of the Heritage Preservation Trust, only to find a trail of breadcrumbs that led directly to my porch. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice booming with a false heartiness that made my skin crawl. "A little matter of some property lines on the waterfront. My daughter mentioned you might have some sentimental attachment to those lots." "It's not sentiment, Mr. Clinton," I said, intentionally using a name I knew he hated being confused with, though I kept my voice sweet. "It's stewardship. My father didn't leave me that land to be a driveway for a glass cage. He left it to me to ensure the character of this city remains intact." There was a pause. I could hear him muffled, likely covering the receiver to hiss something at his daughter. When he came back, the heartiness was gone. "Look, let's be practical. Everyone has a price. We're prepared to offer you 3 times the market value. You could move into one of the penthouses. You'd never have to worry about clutter again." "I don't worry about clutter now," I said, looking at the intricate web in the roses. "And I'm afraid you've mistaken my silence for a negotiation. I'm not selling. In fact, I've just signed an agreement with a local environmental group to conduct a multi-year study on the soil health of those lots. It seems there's a specific type of moss that only grows in the shade of dated structures. We can't have you paving over it, can we?" The sound he made was a choked sort of rage. He hung up without a goodbye. The pressure began to mount. The bank, alerted by the stop work order and the new environmental complications, froze their next draw of construction funds. In the world of high-stakes development, a freeze is a death sentence. Interest payments don't stop just because the hammers do. A few hours later, my son was at my door. He didn't ring the bell. He knocked a frantic, uneven rhythm. When I opened the door, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot. "Ma, what are you doing?" he whispered, stepping into the foyer. "You're destroying us." Her father is losing everything. Our house, the baby's future. It's all tied to this project. Why didn't you just tell us you owned the land? I walked into the kitchen and began to peel a peach. I didn't look at him. "Why didn't you tell me my gift was in the trash, son?" He flinched. "Is this about a blanket? A quilt?" "Ma, it's just fabric. We can buy 100 of them." She was stressed. She wasn't thinking. "It was never about the fabric," I said, finally looking up. My voice was quiet, but it had the weight of a gavel. "It was about the fact that you stood there and watched her discard your history. You let her treat your mother like a guest who had overstayed her welcome in your life. You chose her vision over your foundation. And now, you're discovering what happens when a building has no foundation." "Ma, please," he cracked. "Talk to her father. Fix the paperwork. I'll make her apologize. I'll make her bring the quilt back." "The quilt is gone, son. The garbage trucks took it 10 days ago. I watched them from my car. I watched the things I made for your child get crushed in the back of a bin while you were inside drinking mimosas." He sank into a kitchen chair, the same chair he used to sit in to do his homework. "What do you want then? Do you want us to beg?" "I want you to understand the cost of things," I said. "You've spent so much time learning how to be curated that you've forgotten how to be real. You want me to save you? I've spent 30 years saving you. From the time you fell off your bike to the time you needed help with your first down payment. But you've grown too big for my protection, haven't you? You wanted a modern life. Well, this is it. This is how the modern world works. When you fail to secure your borders, you lose your territory." He stayed for an hour, pleading, then shouting, then weeping. I stayed calm. I offered him a glass of water. I treated him with the polite, distant kindness of a stranger. When he finally left, he looked older. The boy I had raised was buried somewhere under the weight of his own choices, and for the first time, I didn't reach in to pull him out. I went back to my work. The black silk suit was almost finished. It was sharp, cold, and perfect. I had an invitation to a city council meeting the following evening, a public hearing about the viability of the waterfront project. I knew my daughter-in-law would be there. She would be there to play the victim, to talk about progress and community growth. She still thought she was the lead actress in this play. She didn't realize I was the one who had written the script, and we were just now reaching the climax of Act 2. I picked up my hook and began to work on the final detail of the suit, a small, intricate rose for the lapel. It was beautiful, but if you touched the stem, you'd find it was reinforced with wire. It looked soft, but it held its shape. Just like me, there is a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when the person everyone expects to be a victim walks in as a victor. The city council chambers were packed, the air thick with the smell of wet umbrellas and the nervous sweat of people whose bank accounts were tied to the fate of a pile of concrete. I arrived late. It's a tactical choice. When you arrive early, you are part of the scenery. When you arrive late, the scenery must adjust to accommodate you. I wore the black silk suit I had finished the night before. It fit me like a second skin, armored, elegant, and uncompromising. I didn't carry a crochet bag or a tray of cookies. I carried a single, slim leather briefcase. My daughter-in-law was seated in the front row, flanked by her father and a team of lawyers who looked like they were made of sharkskin and expensive cologne. When she saw me walk down the center aisle, her eyes widened. She had never seen me in anything but house dresses and aprons. She didn't recognize the woman walking toward the podium. She only recognized the threat. The council president banged his gavel. We are here to discuss the petition for a permanent injunction on the north access road of the waterfront development filed by the Heritage Preservation Trust. Her father stood up, his voice booming with the practiced authority of a man who usually gets his way. This is a frivolous delay, Mr. President. We have investors from across the country watching this city. We have millions of dollars already in the ground. To halt progress because of a few feet of dirt owned by a shadowy trust is an insult to the future of this community. He looked back at me, a sneer curling his lip. He thought I was just an obstacle to be cleared. He didn't know I was the finish line. The council president looked at me. Mrs. Thompson, as the representative of the Heritage Trust, do you wish to speak? I walked to the microphone. I didn't lean on the podium. I stood straight, my hands resting lightly on the wood. I didn't look at the council. I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had called my life dated. Progress is a curious word, I said, my voice low and steady, carrying easily through the silent room. We often use it to describe the act of building, but we rarely use it to describe the act of remembering. Mr. Clinton speaks of millions of dollars. I speak of something far more valuable, integrity. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I have here the original land grant from 1922. It contains a restrictive covenant. The land I own cannot be used for commercial transit if it disrupts the historical watershed of the surrounding neighborhoods. My daughter-in-law's father knew this. His lawyers knew this. They simply assumed that an old woman in this neighborhood wouldn't have the resources or the spine to enforce it. A murmur rippled through the room. One of the sharkskin lawyers leaned over to whisper frantically in Mr. Clinton's ear. My daughter-in-law's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. But more importantly, I continued, I have the results of a private audit. It seems that in the rush to clear the ground, certain safety protocols regarding the foundation of the main tower were overlooked. When you treat the ground you stand on with contempt, you cannot be surprised when it refuses to support you. I laid the audit on the clerk's desk. It was a gift from Martha at the bank. She had noticed the discrepancies in the building materials invoices weeks ago. They had been using a lower grade of steel to save money they needed to pay off the bridge loans that were currently suffocating them. The room erupted. The investors in the back rows began to stand up. Cell phones were pulled out. The vision was dissolving in real time. My daughter-in-law stood up, her belly leading the way, her eyes bright with a desperate, frantic rage. You're doing this because of a baby shower? You're ruining our lives over a blanket. The council president hammered for order, but I didn't look away from her. I waited for the room to quiet just enough so my whisper could be heard. I'm doing this because you forgot that you are not the only person who matters in a room, I said. You threw away a gift because it didn't fit your aesthetic. Now, you'll find that the world you've built doesn't fit the reality of your debt. She looked at her husband, my son. He was sitting 2 rows back, his head in his hands. He didn't stand up to defend her. He didn't look at me. He was finally seeing the architecture of the life he had chosen, and he realized he was trapped in a room with no exits. The council voted 5-2 to uphold the injunction and launch a full investigation into the building materials. It was a death blow. The project was dead. The Clinton family name was headline news, and not for the reasons they wanted. As I walked out of the chambers, her father tried to block my path. He was shaking, his face a deep, dangerous purple. You've ruined her. You've ruined your own grandchild's inheritance. Do you feel proud of yourself? I stopped and adjusted my lapel. A child doesn't inherit money, Mr. Clinton. A child inherits a name. I'm simply making sure the name my grandchild carries isn't one built on a lie. As for the money, I've already set up a trust for the baby. It's managed by me. He'll have everything he needs. But his mother, She's going to have to learn how to make something with her own two hands. I walked past him into the cool night air. The next 3 weeks, the Clinton empire didn't just fall, it evaporated. When the bank pulled the funding, the subcontractors walked off the job within 48 hours. The cranes on the waterfront stood like skeletal monuments to a vanity that could no longer be sustained. I stayed in my home, the windows open to let in the scent of the turning season. I didn't watch the news. I didn't need to. I could hear the echoes of the disaster in every frantic phone call from my son. He was no longer the confident young man with the polished shoes. He was a man drowning in a sea of litigation and debt, gasping for air that his wife's family could no longer provide. "They're taking the house, Ma," he whispered into the phone one Tuesday evening. "The foreclosure notice came today. Her father, he's being investigated for securities fraud. She's been crying for 3 days. She's 8 months pregnant, and we have nowhere to go." I didn't offer a room. I didn't offer a check. I simply picked up a stray piece of black yarn from my carpet and rolled it between my thumb and forefinger. The house was built on sand. "Son," I said, "you can't be surprised when the tide comes in. Did she find that blanket she bought for $400? Surely that will keep the baby warm." "Ma, please, stop with the blanket. We're losing everything." "No," I corrected him gently. "You're losing the things you thought defined you. You still have your hands. You still have your health. You just don't have the stage." I hung up and went to my front porch. A moving truck was parked 3 doors down, a young family moving in. I watched them carry in boxes of mismatched furniture, laughing as they struggled with a heavy sofa. They looked happy. They looked solid. They reminded me of how we used to be back when my son's father was alive, and we counted our wealth in the number of people sitting at our dinner table rather than the square footage of our foyer. My daughter-in-law showed up an hour later. She didn't come in a luxury SUV this time. She came in a taxi. She looked smaller, her designer clothes hanging loosely on a frame that had been hollowed out by stress. She didn't walk up my steps with the stride of a queen. She climbed them like a beggar. "I know you hate me," she said before I could even open the screen door. Her voice was thin, stripped of its glass and silk edge. "I don't hate you," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Hate is an active emotion. It requires an investment of energy. I simply have no use for you." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "My father is going to prison. My son, your grandson, is going to be born into a world where we have nothing. Doesn't that mean anything to you? Is your pride really worth more than his comfort?" I stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind me. I wanted the conversation to stay outside, where the trash is kept. "You talk about comfort as if it's a right," I said. "You threw my heart in the garbage because it didn't match your curtains. You tried to pave over the history of this neighborhood because it was an inconvenience to your profit. You didn't care about the comfort of the families who have been here for generations. Why should I care about yours?" "I'll apologize," she sobbed, the tears finally breaking through the mask. "I'll do whatever you want. Just tell the bank to release the injunction. Tell them the land is yours, and you've changed your mind. My father says if you do that, the investors might come back." I looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since the baby shower. I saw the fear in her eyes, but I also saw the calculation. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she got caught. She was still trying to find a way to pivot, to curate a new version of the truth where she was the victim and I was the savior she had successfully manipulated. "I can't do that," I said. "Why not?" "Because the land isn't mine anymore." I lied. It was a beautiful, calculated lie. I've donated the Heritage Trust lots to the city as a permanent memorial park. It's being named after my father. The paperwork was finalized this morning. No one can build there now. Not for 100 years. She fell onto the top step, her head in her hands. The finality of it hit her like a physical weight. The access road was gone. The project was dead. The crown jewel was now nothing more than a graveyard for her father's ambitions. "What are we supposed to do?" she whispered. "You're going to do what I did," I said, sitting in my rocking chair. "You're going to start from the bottom. You're going to find a small apartment. You're going to get a job that requires you to work until your back aches. And you're going to raise that boy to know that the most valuable things in this life are the things you make yourself, not the things you buy with someone else's reputation." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a sudden, sharp realization. "You planned this. From the moment I put that bag in the garage, you didn't just want to stop the project. You wanted to strip us bare." "I wanted to see if there was anything real underneath the polish," I said, beginning to rock slowly. "It turns out there wasn't. But don't worry. A new life is like a new quilt. It starts with a lot of loose scraps and a whole lot of pain. If you're lucky, you might eventually turn into something worth keeping." I watched her walk back down to the street. Her shoulders slumped, her world in ruins. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel regret. I felt the quiet, steady satisfaction of a job well done. The edges were clean. The stitches were tight. The final step in any grand design isn't the display. It's the securing of the knot. In crochet, if you don't pull that last loop tight and weave the tail back into the work, the entire structure remains vulnerable. I spent the morning of my grandson's birth in the quiet of my sunroom, finishing the only gift I ever intended for him to keep. The call came from my son at dawn. He sounded different, hollow yet grounded. The artifice had been stripped away by the reality of a hospital waiting room and the knowledge that his bank account was empty. "He's here, Ma," he said. £7. He has your eyes. And he's beautiful." "I'm coming," I said. I didn't rush. I dressed in a soft, lilac suit, approachable, gentle, the image of a doting grandmother. I picked up a small, unassuming cardboard box. Inside was a simple, white cotton blanket. No colors, no history, just a clean slate. When I walked into the hospital room, the air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and exhaustion. My daughter-in-law was lying in the bed, her face pale, her hair unwashed. My son sat in a plastic chair by her side, holding a small bundle wrapped in a generic hospital swaddle. The room was small, the kind of room the insurance pays for when the gold-plated plans have been canceled. There were no flowers, no curated gifts, just the three of them, huddled together in the wreckage of their former lives. "Can I hold him?" I asked. My son handed me the baby. He was warm, a heavy, living weight in my arms. I looked down at his face, and for a moment, the steel in my heart softened. He was innocent. He was the only thing in this room that wasn't a consequence of a mistake. "He needs something of his own," I said softly. I opened my box and pulled out the white blanket. I wrapped him in it, tucking the edges with practiced precision. My daughter-in-law watched me, her eyes wary, her spirit broken. She looked at the blanket. It was plain, simple, and perfectly executed. "It's beautiful," she whispered. It was the first honest thing she had ever said to me. "It's a foundation," I replied. "It's strong, it's washable, and it's yours. Use it." I leaned over and kissed her forehead. It wasn't a kiss of forgiveness. It was a kiss of closure. I was letting her know that the war was over because there was nothing left for her to fight with. I had taken her status, her father's pride, and her husband's blind devotion. I had reduced her to a mother. Now, she would have to find out if she was any good at it. As I prepared to leave, I turned to my son. "I've taken care of the hospital bill, and I've rented a small house for you in my neighborhood. The rent is modest, and the lease is in my name. You'll stay there until you can prove you can stand on your own 2 feet. He looked at me, tears welling in his eyes. Thank you, Ma. I don't know why you're doing this after everything. I'm doing it because I'm a builder, I said, my hand on the door handle. And you can't build anything worth having on a pile of trash. You have to start with the basics. You have to learn the value of a single stitch. I walked out of the hospital and into the bright morning sun. My son's wife would never know that the simple white blanket I gave the baby was actually lined with a silk fabric I had woven myself, a fabric that contained a small, hidden pocket. Inside that pocket was a document, a fully funded educational trust, and a deed to a property that would be the boy's on his 21st birthday. I had secured his future, but I had removed his mother's ability to ruin it. She would spend the next 20 years believing they were poor, learning the humility she so desperately lacked. She would learn to appreciate the dated women who brought her casseroles and watched her child while she worked. She would become part of the community she once tried to erase. The revenge wasn't in her destruction. It was in her transformation. I had forced her to live the life I lived, the life of a woman who has to earn every inch of respect she gets. As I drove home, I saw the empty waterfront where the Clinton Towers were supposed to be. The city had already started planting trees on the lots I had donated. It was going to be a beautiful park, a place where children could play on ground that couldn't be bought. I pulled into my driveway and went inside. I sat in my rocking chair and picked up my crochet hook. I didn't have a project in mind, so I just started a simple chain. One loop, one pull, one tuck. The world is a very large place, but it's held together by very small things. And as long as I have my hands and my silence, I will make sure the right things stay together and the wrong things fall apart. They thought I was just a ghost in their machine, a relic to be discarded. They didn't realize that a mother's love can build a kingdom, but a grandmother's memory can dismantle an empire. If you ever find yourself underestimating a woman who has spent her life observing the world through the eye of a needle, remember this: the thread that binds is the same thread that can choke. Don't let your history be tossed in the trash. Subscribe to Old School Payback and hit the notification bell to hear more stories of those who learned the hard way that respect isn't an option, it's the price of admission.